to my photography journey. My name's Steve and thank you for joining me. This week we're going to look at what is on that display when you're out taking a picture. So this won't be everything, but it's the highlights. It's what I have on my screen so that I can easily check my settings, I can easily see what my exposure is and easily change things as necessary. So let's go. First up, let's go in a logical order. So first up, we've got the size of the picture. So I shoot in RAW, so that means I've got the most flexibility when it comes to editing. I can make the most changes to it, make it darker, make it lighter without having any problems with the image not behaving how I want it to. The alternative is saving it as a JPEG, which is kind of, it's got less of that flexibility. The camera puts its own stamp on it. It's great if that's what you want your image to look like, but for me, I want to have that flexibility of actually doing what I want with the image at the end of the day. And then along with that, the L means that it's the largest size possible, so that yes, it takes up more space on my memory card, and as I shoot redundant, so I've got the two memory cards, that means that it will save a copy of the same picture to both memory cards, so essentially halving my storage, but it means I've got a backup. So if something happened to one, then I've still got the other one in order to make that picture how I want it to be and potentially sell it or something if that's what I want to. So I have it as large as possible in order to do as much with it as possible after the fact. The H and the pictures of images, that means that I have my camera set to the high burst rate. So when I press and hold the shutter, it will take as many pictures as it can until I let go. Generally speaking, on the Z5, I think it's about 4 or 5 a second, which isn't a lot compared to some cameras, but is significantly more than my old Fujifilm could do. That was kind of 1 or 2 pictures and then the memory would fill up, whereas this could take 40, 50, 60 without any problems. The other options for that are single or low rate. So depending on what situation it is, you may only want to take that one single picture. But for me, I'd rather have more pictures than not enough. So for example, if it's a group picture that I'm taking, if I press and hold, it'll take lots of frames, and that means that I'm more likely to get everyone looking in the direction of the camera, everyone smiling, everyone with their eyes open, rather than just taking a single picture and hoping for the best. Then the next two on the side here are the autofocus or manual focus. So I've got it set to AFS, which is autofocus single. So I choose a point, I kind of set the focus there by half pressing the shutter button or pressing the AF on button on the back of the camera, and then it will fix to that point. And the image below that kind of shows how big the area is that it will look at. So this is kind of a small square. You can have a smaller square, you can have the whole image frame. It just depends what you want to take a picture of basically, and how much or what you want to have in focus. Along with that, you've also got the AF continuous mode, where it will follow a subject around. So eye tracking, for example, is a big one, where it will try and lock on to where the eye is. As long as you've got that shutter button or the AF button pressed, it will follow it, and the lens will zoom in and out depending on what's going on, where that is, where the eye moves to, and then it should always take a picture that's in focus on that particular point. Lots has been said about Nikon autofocus. It works for me, but I'm not the most demanding of users, so I also have no experience with other systems to know whether that would be any better or worse. Picture profiles. These are kind of how the camera will interpret the image that it brings into the sensor. So light comes through the lens onto the sensor. The computer in the camera kind of looks at the colors and makes a decision on this area should be this color, this area should be that color. And it's these picture profiles that influence that. I tend to set mine to flat so that it does the least adjustment as possible, so that, coming back to what I said earlier, in editing, I've then got the most flexibility in order to do what I want to the picture. And from there, you can then adjust it however you want it. But if you don't want to do that in post-processing, or if you want to have a particular starting point, a particular style to begin with, then that's what you can change. So you can have it to auto, where it changes based on the light and things like that. You can have it as vivid, you can have it as flat like me, and various other options. I haven't explored them all particularly, I just keep mine on flat. And then there's a K. Why is there a K? And that is my white balance. And K obviously doesn't stand for white balance, it stands for Kelvin, which is the temperature of the light. So how cold or blue or how yellow or warm that light is. I set mine to basically daylight, which is 5600 Kelvin, which is quite a cool light. But it means that I've got a fixed starting point so that I can then adjust it in Lightroom. I can make it warmer, I can make it cooler, depending on what the situation actually needs. And even for filming like this, I've got a big skylight, so daylight is quite a nice temperature, and then I can color things. So I've got the blue light at the side here, so I can color things how I want them to make them look the way that I want them to look. Next up, we've got FX, and that's not some kind of special effects that I've got it in the camera. It means the area size of the photo. And FX is, in Nikon speak, the full frame. The other option is the APS-C crop, which in Nikon speak is DX. FX and DX. I tend to try and use FX as much as possible so that I'm using that full frame, using as many pixels as possible, using as much of that sensor in the camera as possible, so that I've got the most quality. Again, coming back to editing and things, the more pixels that you've got to work with, the better. However, the DX crop does come in very useful because it essentially uses fewer of those pixels, so the image quality isn't quite as high, but it's still fantastic. But you kind of zoom in with it. It makes everything a bit larger in the frame because of the way that the sensor works. It just kind of zooms slightly, crops in like the digital crop on, or sorry, digital zoom on your own iPhone, for example. If you zoom in with that, that's just using fewer of the pixels and zooming into what's in the middle and making them bigger. So that can be useful, particularly if you don't have a zoom lens and something that you want to take a picture of is just out of reach. So you can do it there and then, rather than having to kind of crop things in Lightroom afterwards. And then following on from there, we have the Bluetooth symbol. So one of the great things about my camera is that it can connect to my phone via Bluetooth. So it uses that for its location data for the images. So every picture I take has GPS coordinates attached to it. And the other thing is transferring pictures from the camera onto my phone. You can either do it at the full size, or you can do it at a 2 megapixel size. So it's quite a nice way to just quickly share a picture with someone that you've just taken. For example, I had my Christmas party back in December, took a few group pictures, and then could quickly text a 2 megapixel version to everyone before editing the full version afterwards. Carrying on along the bottom, we've got the amount of space that's available on the memory card, so the number of pictures I can still take, in this case 920, so plenty basically. Next up is our ISO, and this is our amplifier for our light. So the lower the number, the less kind of amplification of that light. I've done a whole video about ISO, so have a look back at that and that will give you the full details. But basically, to make your picture brighter, you increase the ISO. What this can also do though is increase the noise that's in that picture. And it's a balance. It's one of those tools that you can use to get a better picture, and it's just adapting that, your aperture and your shutter speed, to get the result that you want. Talking of those two, they are the next two up. So You've got your aperture, which in this case is f1.8. Again, aperture and shutter speed is something that I've talked about before, so have a look back on those videos. But f1.8 is a wide aperture. It's allowing as much light as possible into the camera, and it also gives you a narrow depth of field, which means the subject, for example in this video, me, I am in focus, whereas my background is blurred because of that narrow depth of field. Whereas if it was a larger number, so a larger f number, which means that the actual hole that the light's coming through is narrower, that gives you a bigger depth of field, which means that we would both be in focus, both myself and the background would be in focus. So landscape photography, that tends to be what I would use, so that you've got the foreground and the background in focus. But for products or portraits, that narrow depth of field kind of isolates your subject from the background, like this. Shutter speed, how quickly or how slowly the shutter opens and closes in order to let the light hit the sensor. Again, it's a tool. So those three, ISO, aperture and shutter speed, all affect the exposure of the image. So on the side, we also have the exposure meter, with plus being lighter, negative being darker, and then a 0 point in the middle, which is kind of correctly exposed. This is all based on metering, which is again at the bottom. You've got different ways of metering, whether it's the whole picture, whether it's just a particular spot or the center. That is shown in this kind of square with a dot in the middle. For me, I like mine to be based on what I'm focusing on rather than the whole frame. So you adjust your settings, your ISO, your shutter speed, your aperture, in order to move that marker up and down basically, and get the exposure that you want for that picture. So like I said, 0 is meant to be perfectly exposed. I tend to go to either 0 or just below, so that when I am editing it, I know that I can make dark areas brighter easier than I can make light areas darker. And that way I've got more dark areas in my picture, so that it just makes my life easier basically. As I said, next up is our metering. So I've got mine set to a spot metering, and that means that where I'm focused is what it's going to take into account how dark, how light it is. So I've then got a bit more control over what I want to particularly take a picture of, and then adjust everything for that. But that symbol would change if you were using the whole frame, if you were using kind of a matrix where it balances the frame and the focus point. So that's what that means. I talk more about the metering in my video about my camera settings, so again, have a look back at that and learn something else there. Next up, we've got our battery. As you can see, it's about 20% now, but there we go, fully charged. So this will last all day basically when I'm out taking photos. I've said before that I have a spare battery, good investment, so that you don't have to worry about that one, but it's there on the screen. It'll go red and start flashing at you if there's a problem. Then coming around the corner, we have our shutter. So I have mine set to auto, which means it will switch between the electronic shutter, which is all digital, and the actual kind of manual physical shutter, which is something that goes up and down in front of the sensor. And as I said, we've got the shutter speed, which is in fractions of a second. So 100th of a second means that that's the time that it will be open for before closing again. So it's very quick, it's very impressive. I've not found a difference between the physical shutter and the electronic shutter. Sometimes you can have problems based on kind of movement and things like that between the two, but again, it's not something that I've experienced, so I can't really comment on that one. Something that helps you take pictures at slightly slower shutter speeds and allow more light to come in is vibration reduction. So in the camera, I've got kind of stabilization to stop the movement of the camera affecting the image. So you still get nice sharp image even at slightly slower shutter speeds. It doesn't solve things completely, so you can't actually take like a 5-second exposure while hand holding it. There will be movement, your picture will be blurry, but for kind of a little bit slower than you might otherwise, it does allow you to go that little bit slower while still hand holding. So if you've forgotten your tripod, it's ideal. And then coming round, we've got manual mode, and we've talked about this before. Again, that's all I'm doing here is linking to my old videos, but basically manual mode allows you to be in most control of the settings of your camera. You adjust the ISO, you adjust the aperture, and you adjust the shutter speed. Whereas you've got other modes that will do some or all of that for you. I like to be in manual mode so that I've got the most control about things, so that when it comes back to editing, I can do what I want with it, basically. So everything that you see in my images is because I've made it that way. From the settings on the camera to the settings of the image file itself to then what happens in Lightroom, that's all me, basically. So I've got no one to blame but myself if they don't turn out well. So thank you for watching my photography journey. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you again next week. Bye.